Okay, camera's rolling, audio is rolling. All right, Tim, action.
Hello, my name's Tim Malone, and I'm a retired American history teacher. And I'm taping my lectures for my YouTube channel, Tim Malone History Lectures. Check it out. Today I'm going to talk about the Vietnam War, which, since I turned 75 last week, a baby boomer, sort of my war, my generation's war, the Vietnam War. Boy, I kind of lived the Vietnam War. Although I never went, never got drafted, didn't sign up, never in the military. I was high school class of 69. By 69, the war was being wound down by Richard Nixon, President Nixon. It would take 6 more years for the final end of the war. But I was surprised how many of my high school classmates, I went to a small high school, ended up in Vietnam, even though it was the wind down phase. More than I would have guessed, talking at reunions. The Vietnam War. Now, if you watch my lecture on the Korean War, you'll find that the Korean War has an epitaph. It's the Korean War, the Forgotten War. Now, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, if you would have said, well, the Vietnam War is going to be forgotten, I would have said, no way, man, no way. It was a far more profound experience for the entire nation. Now, that's hard to say if you're a Korean War vet, if you're a Korean War, if that was your war, Korean War. It's hard to say because 20 years ago, nobody would have said, oh, we're not going to forget Vietnam. Vietnam's not going to end up like Korea, a forgotten war. But here we are in 2026. And I get this notion in my brain, Vietnam is being forgotten. It's being forgotten. The Vietnam War is going to become another forgotten war. And boy, again, there was a time in my life when you said, I said, no way, man, no way, Vietnam is going to stick. Like World War II is stuck. If you go to my World War II lecture, we're still living World War II far more than we're living either Korea or Vietnam today in 2026. And that's 80 years ago, World War II. Of course, World War II was a far bigger war, total mobilization. I don't know. Even as a historian, it's hard for me to suss these things out sometimes. What's going to stick? I mean, is that the right word? What's going to stick in the culture and what isn't? Because like we said about Korea, there's no date on the calendar about the Korean War. There's several about World War II still. And there's no date. There used to be April, what was that date? April 14th or April 15th, 1975, when the United States had choppers on the embassy roof in Saigon and everybody's getting out and there's a scramble and people are holding on to the helicopter landing gear to get out as the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong take Saigon and the war is over. That used to be every year, but no, that's gone. I mean, Vietnam's vanishing in our culture, which is kind of amazing because 2.5 million Americans served in Vietnam. Well, first, let me say, Vietnam War. The shorthand, 1965 to 1975. For a historian, that's neat, 10 years. The Vietnam War, 10 years. March 8th, I believe is the date, 1965, when American troops, now there had been American advisors, there had been American military men in Vietnam before March of 65, but March of 65 was when the U.S. Army and the Marines hit the beaches. I mean, literally hit the beaches. On the news that night, and I remember it, they had these landing craft come in, and goes down like D-Day in World War II, and these American troops come off into South Vietnam. The cameras, it was staged. It was staged. Of the 2.5 million Americans that served in Vietnam, almost all of them were flown in, of course, and flown out. But Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time, who's responsible for the Vietnam War, as it turned out, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who just won a smashing victory in November of '64, one of the all-time landslides in American history, Lyndon Johnson, who'd become president when Kennedy got shot in November of '63. Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, one of the most powerful presidents we ever had. He decided that he wanted a war in South Vietnam. Now, he already had several thousand advisors in Vietnam, going back to Kennedy, going back to 1961, 1962. We sent advisors in, military advisors, Green Berets, to advise the South Vietnamese army in their struggle against the communists. And again, I refer you back to my lecture on McCarthyism. This anti-communist nonsense was strong in 1965. We were going to stop the communists in South Vietnam. South Vietnam, talk about something that's been forgotten. The Vietnam War was about South Vietnam, this artificial nation that was created in 1954 at the Geneva Conventions in an effort to rationalize the transition of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from French colonial rule. The French had been in Vietnam, French Indochina it was called, since the 1870s, when the European powers were dividing up the world into colonies. The French took what would become known as French Indochina. Today, the nations of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were French Indochina. And the French took it, militarily conquered it. Well, mostly. There was never a time in Vietnam when they weren't resisting European colonial encroachments. And in 1954, the French were defeated. The Vietnamese defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, the final battle, where a French army surrendered. And the world called a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, 1954, and they divided French Indochina up. And they divided Vietnam up into North Vietnam, which was given to the victorious communists, Ho Chi Minh, the communists. The anti-colonial, the Vietnamese nationalistic movement against the French and then against the Americans was led by communists, Vietnamese communists. Now, of course, in retrospect, most historians agree that the Vietnamese communists, that communism, Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, an amalgamation, this, people don't agree about these labels. The Vietnamese nationalists, Europeans out, Vietnam for Vietnamese, was led by Marxists, was led by communists, because there they could find support in the wider world for their anti-colonial efforts. It was an independence movement. Vietnamese communists were the leaders of a Vietnamese independence movement. Now, we never got that. We, of course, McCarthyism, this fixation with communism, monolithic communism, all communists take their orders from Moscow. That played a big role in the Vietnam War. Who were we fighting? Communists. We never understood, and some Americans still don't, that Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese nationalist first, a communist second. He was using Marxist-Leninism as a rallying cry for anti-colonial, anti-imperial means or effort. wow, it's complicated. There was, back in 1965, when the troops hit the beach in a staged PR effort, they did public opinion polls, and 80% of Americans couldn't find Vietnam on a map. Now, of course, that changes when 2.5 million, mostly young men, mostly drafted, are sent to this far-off spot. That changes. Now, a couple of years ago, they did a poll, and 80% of Americans can't find Vietnam on a map now again. 58,000 Americans died. Three boys from my high school died. 300,000 Americans were wounded in Vietnam, and you still occasionally, because again, I think my point here is that Vietnam, despite what I thought 20 or 30 years ago, is going to be forgotten. That effort, Vietnam had more of an impact on the country at large, on the culture, than Korea did. Korea, there was no anti-war movement to speak of. Vietnam, there was a huge anti-war movement that divided the nation. And one of the reasons that Vietnam was so hot, was so contentious, was because that division of the country into pro-war, anti-war, was just about 50-50. It was an even divide. And that led to the troubles, to the Vietnam Syndrome, which I'm going to talk about here, which I think is a good term for it, the Vietnam Syndrome. Now, again, some years ago, I would have said the Vietnam Syndrome is with us forever. But now I'm beginning to think, no, Vietnam is going to be forgotten, like Korea, despite the profound effect it had on the nation itself, the profound effect it had on the culture. Now, one of the aspects of the Vietnam Syndrome, and I got an outline here, but I'm just talking because, again, I lived through this. I lived through the arguments. I lived through the 50-50 split nation on Vietnam. It's kind of visceral for me. And the 60s, part of the Vietnam Syndrome was something we call the 60s, the 1960s. And that, to me, has all kinds of ramifications that you can still see today. I was teaching, I taught for 25 years at Elgin Community College in Elgin, Illinois, 18, 19, 20-year-olds mostly. And from the very beginning, when I started my teaching there, up until the end, which was about 5 years ago, when I talked about Vietnam, when I talked about the 60s, and the Vietnam War was a crucial ingredient in what we call the 60s, the Cultural Revolution it was called. There was a cultural revolution wrapped around and with the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The 60s. I'd tell my classes, I'd look out and I'd say, I see the 60s right here, even if it was 2010 or 2015 when I was teaching. Why? The way you dress, the way you wear your hair, facial hair. I mean, a lot of people alive today who weren't alive back in 1960 or 1965 don't understand the conformity. Men didn't have long hair. Crew cut, everybody. And boy, oh boy, to remember the hair wars. Families were split. Children were disowned because of the length of their hair, or because they wanted to grow a mustache, or they wanted to grow their beard out. You couldn't do that. Nobody did that. You're saying, what? What? Yeah, I know, I understand. It's what? You couldn't have your hair down below the collar of your shirt, or you would be ostracized. You would be picked on. The 60s changed that. And now, and the foolishness, the idiocy of of condemning someone, of disowning someone because they grew their hair out, that happened. Now, I had a big head of hair, and it was unmanageable. It's still kind of unmanageable, even though it's gone. So I always kept my hair short because that's what I wanted. Because it was easier I had to get a comb through my hair at times in my life. But friends and family, cousins, it's hard to explain. Now, of course, the movement, the Cultural Revolution ultimately won that. And I'd say to my students, I say, look at you. Look, in 1960 and 1965, no, there'd be no beards, no mustaches, no long hair on boys. The anti-war movement played a key role in these cultural changes. You used to dress up in a tie and a sports jacket or a suit to fly on an airplane. It was accepted practice. You dressed up to fly in an airplane in 1962. When I was a kid in the 60s, men didn't wear shorts. I'm not kidding. No male in 1962 wore shorts ever. Those things were changed, plus marijuana is legal now, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The women's liberation movement. The 60s I probably should do a lecture just on the 60s because of the profound changes. And of course the civil rights movement, which is just a few years before the war. And the civil rights movement was stirred into the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. All mixed in with the anti-war movement. All mixed in with the profound, what we thought at the time was profound changes that the war and the resistance to the war and the outcome of the war had changed forever. And again, I just, preparing for this lecture, I started thinking about, and because I'd just done the Korean War, the Forgotten War, I was thinking, man, Vietnam's being forgotten. It's going to end up the same, despite it was bigger than the Korean War and longer and had profound cultural implications. It's being forgotten. Now, one of the reasons that the Vietnam War is being forgotten, well, everybody's getting older, but one of the reasons is that it changed our foreign policy for a while. It was called the Vietnam Syndrome. And one of the things was because we lost. So like I've been saying, the Vietnam War still haunts the politics, culture, and history of the United States. Still, although I think it's waning. Baby boomers especially. And here, this is somewhat granted. For example, the 2004 presidential election. 2004, when George W. Bush, who brought us Afghanistan and Iraq, Vietnam's, the 2004 election, he was running for re-election against John Kerry, senator from Massachusetts. And John Kerry was a Vietnam vet. George Bush was in the military, was in the Texas National Guard during the war, but didn't go to Vietnam, was never mobilized to go to Vietnam. And of course, the Bush family was prominent in Texas, and of course, there's that whole thing. Again, the Vietnam War and its effect are visceral to me. And it's hard for me, as you can probably tell, it's hard for me to get a grip on it. But prominent boys, there were various ways for them to get out of the draft. Oh, the draft. See, every man my age, baby boomer, has a draft story. I don't know if I want to get into mine. I didn't go, you know, I was right on the cusp of the old draft, which was a legacy of Korea and the time between Korea and Vietnam. There was a draft. It was done by local draft boards, which were all crew-cutted World War II veterans. And then in 1969, Congress passed a new draft law where you picked numbers out of a barrel, your birthday, right? And if you got, it was luck of the draw. If you got a low number, you went. If you got a high number, you were safe, you were out. Maybe I'll come back and tell my draft story, but at any rate, I didn't have to go. I mean, I was kind of patriotic, you know, through high school. And, you know, I wasn't that close to my dad. My dad was a World War II veteran, but in World War II, everybody was drafted. And I wasn't that close to my dad, but one day, kind of out of the blue, talking about the draft, my dad said to me, "Don't go unless you have to." And I didn't have to, so I didn't. Now, of course, by the time I got to college, I was anti-war. Walked in a couple of protest marches. Anti-war now. But the 2004 election was a lot about Bush, who was running for re-election, and Kerry, who'd been a commander of a river boat, a river combat boat in Vietnam, about what they did in Vietnam. 2004, now that's a while ago now, 2004. But 2004 election was about Vietnam. What did you do during the war? And you know, not surprisingly, there were lies being told about Kerry. The Vietnam syndrome, I like to call it. But here's the key. The United States lost the Vietnam War. We lost. Now again, if you count up the wars the United States has been in, it's hard because of the chasing some Indians through New Mexico in the 1880s. Is that a war? I mean, they were hesitant to even call Korea a war. I like to say that the Library of Congress, subject headings, and I worked in a library for a while years ago. The Library of Congress subject headings call it the Vietnam conflict. I think they call it that to this day. Officially, the Library of Congress, the Vietnam conflict, not the W word, not war. And remember, if you look at my Korean War lecture again, they hesitated, the culture hesitated to call that a war. It was a police action. Vietnam, or Korea's a police action, Vietnam's a conflict. We've become a little bit less like that because I think we call Iraq and Afghanistan wars from the very get-go. The Vietnam War, we lost. Now, you can get yourself in trouble in some places in this country to this day if you make that very obvious statement. We lost. And usually, in the conversations I've had about that, when I say, well, you know, we lost the war, it's like, well, we could have won. We could have won. If the boys would have been let do their business over there, if they hadn't been stabbed in the back by the anti-war movement, by feckless politicians who didn't have the guts to see it through, we could have won. Well, coulda, shoulda, woulda. We lost. And therefore, the Vietnam War is an affront to American exceptionalism. We don't lose wars. And if we do, it's because somebody on the home front is to blame, those damn hippies. Oh yeah, hippies. I know I'm getting, but let me just pause here and say, there were very few hippies. I hung out with hippies, but I was never a hippie. Very few, because there was a street theater element to hippiedom. You know, the hippies were out there. They wanted to project hippiedom. And a lot of hippies were very brave individuals. But they were like street performers. Being a hippie was an act. There was a costume. There's far fewer hippies than hippie bashers thought. Yes, we lost. Let me explain that. The Vietnam War was about a place called South Vietnam, a nation called South Vietnam. We were sent, Johnson and then Nixon, the presidents, the boys were sent to Vietnam to save South Vietnam, just like we saved South Korea from the commies. Get a map out. Is there a South Vietnam today? No. South Vietnam was destroyed despite the efforts of the United States, the blood and money of the United States. South Vietnam was annihilated, taken out of the pages of history by the commies, the commie nationalists. We lost. Our goal, our stated goal, was to save South Vietnam. There's no South Vietnam. Our objective was denied. We lost. Now again, you know, despite the fact that I think Vietnam is fading, let me repeat, you can still get yourself in trouble going some places and stating that mere fact. We lost the Vietnam War. It takes poise to admit defeat. The U.S. was defeated by the Vietnamese, a third-rate power. A third-rate power. Maybe fourth-rate power. Why did the U.S. lose? Considerations of the Vietnam War raise important questions about war in general and war itself. And I've done some of that in the preceding lectures, talked about war. I should do a lecture just on war in general, in history. And along those lines, the Vietnam War raises some important points about modern warfare. Because again, you can say, because there's, and rightfully so, numerically inferior forces in the 1800s, during the great age of European and American imperialism and colonialism. You know, a few thousand British troops ruled India for years. A few thousand French troops ruled Indochina, Vietnam, for 80 years. So technology obviously has something to do with success in war. The more modern nation with the more modern weapons usually wins. It's axiomatic that they will win, but that's not what happened in Vietnam, and that's not what happened in Afghanistan more recently. I mean, Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, they wouldn't even rank in the world's military powers. And yet they defeated the United States. Now again, you can say, well, we could have won, we could have, you know, and talking about Vietnam and we could have, There were those at the time who thought we should have used nuclear weapons on Vietnam. And there were those who saying, we could have turned Vietnam into a nuclear wasteland, into a nuclear parking lot. We could have won that war. We could have nuked them. No, we couldn't. We were supposed to be there to save Vietnam. We could have won. We didn't. We lost. Because public opinion, wow, there's a concept for you, turned against it. Enough. Again, it was about a 50-50 split, I think, the public opinion polls. Do you support the war? Are you opposed to the war? I don't know if I should have looked and seen if there's anybody taking any polls in the last 5 or 10 years about the Vietnam War and asked American people more recently, were you in favor of the war or were you opposed to the war? I would think there'd probably be more people who say they were opposed to it than were at the time because they turned out to be right. Well, I turned out to be right about the Vietnam. I was opposed to the war. Stupid. It was a stupid war. The Vietnam War occurred during the Cold War, which I have a lecture about, 1945 to 1991, the Cold War. And therefore, it was a limited war, and limited wars are problematic. It was a limited war. Now, in some sense, all wars are limited. World War II is usually given as an example of a total war, total mobilization of every person, every factory. Total war. It was a limited war, fought within the context of the nuclear standoff in the Cold War. For example, we bombed the hell, see, here we are again, another off the bombing. We bombed the hell out of Vietnam, both North and South, and Laos and Cambodia. Bombed the hell, and we dropped more bombs, several times more bombs in the Vietnam War than were dropped in all of World War II. We bombed them and bombed them and bombed them. And there's still people today who said, we didn't bomb them enough. Because we didn't bomb the downtown areas of Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam. There were limits, limited war. There were limits on our bombing, but boy, oh boy, don't be fooled. Maybe we didn't bomb downtown Hanoi to rubble, but we bombed and bombed and bombed, and then bombed some more. We'd fly V-52s, 10, 12 of them, and drop bombs. We bombed the hell out of the jungle. We destroyed Cambodia in a secret, we were bombing Cambodia, which is right next to Vietnam, and the Vietnamese guerrillas, they would retreat into Cambodia, and theoretically, Cambodia was neutral. But we secretly, against the law, secret bombing, nobody knew. They forged the logs, the bombers, as to where they bombed. They were bombing Cambodia and pretty much destroyed Cambodia. Cambodia, of course, was had a semi-monarchical government after the Geneva Convention in 1954 that divided French Indochina into North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Cambodia was because the North Vietnamese were using eastern Cambodia as a refuge. And we invaded Cambodia, ground troops into Cambodia a couple times during the war in an effort to close down the Vietnamese bases in Cambodia. I know this is complicated. But we bombed Cambodia secretly. That's a war crime. And we devastated parts of Cambodia, and the government finally fell in Cambodia, and ultimately the Khmer Rouge come to power and genocided a couple of million Cambodians. These Khmer Rouge, these really bloodthirsty, genocidal communists, took over Cambodia for a while and wreaked. If you wore eyeglasses, they killed you because you were supposedly an imperialist, an ally of the imperialists if you wore eyeglasses, the Khmer Rouge. But we did that to Cambodia in the sense that we bombed and bombed and bombed them. Parts of Cambodia were devastated. Bombing. I've threatened before to do one of these lectures on the history of American bombing, because we're the bombingest bombers who ever bombed. And you know, we're still bombing. I think we're bombing groups in Syria today, yesterday. I think there's American planes with bombs, dropping bombs on people, in Yemen. Of course, we bombed Iraq a couple months ago, still threatening to bomb Iran again. I mean, we bombed Vietnam. Didn't work. It was a limited war, and limited wars are problematic. It was a guerrilla war. It was a people's war. It was an insurgency. The Vietnam War highlights the problems of fighting an insurgency, and we're going to relearn that lesson in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, you're saying, well, it's their country. Of course, you're going to have Afghani patriots and Iraqi patriots who are going to be opposed to foreign intervention, even if the foreign intervener, us, are like, we're here for your own good. Don't you want to be American? Don't you want to be like us? American exceptionalism. Everybody wants to be like us. Limited war. Now, I don't know, you know, it seems to me this is a complicated subject. I mean, is our bombing in Yemen, the Houthis, today, is that a limited war? We're bombing elements in Syria, northeastern Syria, today. Is that a limited war? We don't have troops on the ground. We're bombing. And again, the faith in bombing is as American as apple pie. And despite the fact that it's been proven over and over again that you can't bend a culture, a country, to your will by aerial bombardment alone, we still believe in it. As I said before, the war was about South Vietnam. It highlights the American nation-building compulsion. Nation-building, the operative side of American exceptionalism. Don't you want to be like us? Here, let us show you how to be like us. But of course, those that are fighting us in these nation-building wars think it's imperialism. South Vietnam was a nation-building disaster, and the Vietnam Syndrome, which was the name for the period after we were kicked out of Vietnam, when for 15 years we sort of stayed out of nation-building efforts, that we'd learned our lesson, the Vietnam Syndrome. I don't know, you know, in the wake of 9/11, we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, nation building. We hadn't learned our lesson. And what happened? 2 more failures of American nation building efforts. The Vietnam Syndrome didn't hold. This idea, this American exceptionalism, I don't know. I don't even know if I did a lecture on, I don't know, there's several lectures up in my YouTube channel. I don't know if I did one on nation building or if I did one on American exceptionalism. Still very strong, despite the Vietnam failure. Oh, and finally, and again, I've left a lot of these diversions without explanation. I want to talk about the POW MIA myth. The prisoner of war missing in action myth, which is a result of the Vietnam War. The idea that when there was a peace accord, finally, I didn't even talk about the Tet Offensive. In early 1968, the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese had a nationwide in South Vietnam attack. They seized the American embassy in Saigon. They seized bases around the country. Now, ultimately, the Americans retook all those places, of course. The Tet Offensive, it was called. But it took because our government had been saying ever since 1965, 1966, 1967, that we were gaining ground, of course. Oh, there's light at the end of the tunnel was the famous expression. We're winning. There were 550,000 Americans in South Vietnam by then, but we're winning. We're on the verge of victory. And then this Tet Offensive happened, took everybody by surprise. Nationwide, thousands of commie troops. Again, they took our embassy. They took bases around the country. Shocked everybody. The American people being told we're winning, and then this happens. Now, again, to this day, there's Americans who say, well, we won the Tet Offensive. They didn't, thought they were going to take over the country. They didn't. We fought them off. We retook the American embassy. We retook these bases here, there, and everywhere. We retook it. It was a failure. But as a result of the Tet Offensive in early 1968, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the key military leaders of the country, asked Johnson for 200,000 more American troops. Now, what the hell kind of victory is that you win this glorious victory, beating back the commies? It was a victory for America, the Tet Offensive. And then he asked for 200,000 more troops. That would have been 750,000 troops. Johnson said no. He said, no more troops. He gave a speech, I remember it, was March 31st, 1968. Johnson addressed the country. And he said, one, I'm not going to run for re-election in 68. He could have. Well, that's like Truman. Truman couldn't run for re-election because he got stuck in Korea. Johnson couldn't run for re-election because he got stuck in Vietnam. I'm going to open up talks with the Vietnamese, North Vietnam and the Vietnamese communists. That took place in Paris. And I'm going to cut down the draft. Quite a speech. And that was sort of the talks went on for years. Nixon becomes president in '69. And he ups the bombing. He was like, we're going to bomb our way out. I mean, Johnson was bombing enough, but Nixon bombed even more. And Nixon let it be known that he was going to start withdrawing troops. And he did. The Tet Offensive. Turning point in the war. Now, the Vietnamese had captured some 600 Americans, mostly shot down pilots, almost all shot down pilots. And they were holding them, and everybody knew it. There were 600 some of them. Everybody knew they were there. Everybody knew the names of most of them. John McCain, who later became senator from Arizona and ran against Obama in 2008 for president. He died a couple of years ago, John McCain. He was held as prisoner for several years in North Vietnam. Part of the peace agreement, and there was a peace agreement in 1974, the Paris Accords. And of course, as part of the Paris Accords, the North Vietnamese said we're going to release American prisoners. And they did. And I remember the media covered it extensively. These planes would come in and these ex-prisoners would get off and they'd all kiss the ground. It was quite a deal. But starting right then, there were Americans who believed that the dirty, rotten commies didn't give everybody back that they had, that there were prisoners left behind, and that our government was complicit, because our government signed the accords. Our government said, yeah, the Vietnamese have given everybody back that we know of. And there were Americans right then and there, no, you're lying, there's dirty commies, just like a dirty commie, not to give everybody back. That there were still live American prisoners in Vietnam that the Vietnamese held back. Why? Nobody knows. Just because they're dirty commies. That's what a commie would do. They wouldn't give everybody back. And thus started this movement, the POW-MIA movement. Bumper stickers, and you've seen this. And I was teaching, I taught Vietnam, of course, many times in American history class. And the one student, I forget the kid's name, he went out and got me one of these. And of course, everybody's seen these, haven't they? The flag. Now, the Congress, like this, the Congress passed laws, and state legislatures passed law that required buildings to fly this. It was the law. You had to put one of these up. Now, and I was just driving, I got to drive around. I don't know if they're still up. See, I don't think those laws were ever repealed. But now it's 50 years. It's 50 years. And no live American has ever been found in Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos in 50 years, which is what the government's been saying and which what people like me have been saying for 50 years. It's called the POW-MIA myth. It's a myth. Nobody was left behind. Now again, you'd get in trouble in some places. Today, I went to the websites and some of these outfits the outfit that made this flag, families of POWs or something like that, they still have a website up. But I don't know, this is disappearing, isn't it? Well, it ought to. It's been 50 years and no evidence. There's been no evidence found that anybody was ever left behind, ever. But I don't know, are federal buildings still required to fly this flag? They were for a while. I don't know now. I'm going to have to keep my eye open. And here, here's, if you're interested, MIA, or Myth-Making in America. How and why belief in live POWs has possessed a nation. This is 1983. It's an old book by Franklin. It's a great book. If you want to, still, despite its age, if you want to get in on the myth of the POW-MIA, Franklin's book. It's funny, but we're in another age now, the age of Trump, where myths and untruths. The 2020 election was stolen. It can make you pretty pessimistic about human beings, these myths that are held with such ferocity.